Chapter 1. Adian. Line of Decay. Zun, 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 zing, zing, zun. The piercing notes of a violin cut through the silence of a stagnant forest. Adian marched towards a pair of rat-gore, his steps in tempo with the melody of the instrument pinched between his chin and shoulder. The creatures were similar in form to a standard sewer rat, but at least 5 times their size. Their patchy fur and the eerie green light emanating from their eye sockets indicated that they were infected with some form of magical malady. This was unsurprising when accounting for the environment he was chasing them through. It was an old forest of large trees with generous spaces between them. Empty spaces that should have already started to fill up with undergrowth as winter had given way to spring weeks ago. The forest was sick. The trees were barren and cracks, leaking a bright green liquid, meandered along their trunks like poisoned veins. The only thriving plant life that could be seen were patches of bright green moss that were sprinkled around the barren earth or stuck to the sides of dying trees. Strangely, the rat-gore didn't seem slowed by their diseased bodies. Rather the opposite. The sickness appeared to have vitalized them somehow. Maybe it provided some sort of magical strength boost in recompense for the terrible damage it did to their bodies. Or perhaps it was something as simple as the disease preventing the rat-gores from being able to feel pain, leading them to push their bodies harder and for longer than they normally would. Regardless of whatever benefit the magical disease was giving the rat-gores, they were still losing ground. This was odd, since rat-gore were usually faster than people. Adian smiled as he felt his skill, motivational march, push each step just a bit further than it should have. It wouldn't be long before. "Well now, why in tarnation are you taking a stroll whilst strumming that funny little guitar of yours? We paid for your services a good bit ago, and I haven't seen you do any of the hunting that we're paying for." A nasally voice shouted in the country drawl that seemed to miraculously appear in those who lived more than a stone's throw away from a town. Adian breathed in and released a long sigh. Why did something like this always happen? Why couldn't he ever just help people in peace? He didn't let his thoughts show on his face, though. He pasted on his best smile and turned to look at the old man, whose combination of craggy wrinkles, pointed skull, and white hair made his head look reminiscent of a mountain topped with snow. The farmer was standing beside a quaint little cottage, looking at Adian as if he was the one responsible for bringing the rot to his stretch of woods. "I know it might not seem like much is being accomplished, but I assure you that I am nearing the goal," Adian said. "What do you mean, nearing what goal? You've been walking in circles round my house since we hired you, and I admit to liking your fancy music, but why aren't you hunting the rat-gores? You said you were an adventurer," Farmer Tillman asked, scratching his white-haired head in a confused, mistrustful way. Barely suppressing another sigh, Adian responded, "I am an adventurer, but I'm sure you know that adventurer in and of itself is not a class. There are many different classes that can be used in the adventuring lifestyle." "I know that," the man said, indignantly. "There's the big guy who wears all the armor, and then there's the guy wearing the green with the bow, and then there's the strong, handsome guy with a big sword, and then there's the pretty girl with a staff that helps the others when they're hurt." That is the stereotypical team, but knights, rangers, warriors, and healers are far from the only classes that adventurers have, and even within those groups of classes, there can be a lot of variation. It's actually pretty interesting when I hired you, I assumed you're one of the guys with the bows wearing green. 'Cause you're wearing green." Adian, who, up until this point, had been attempting to play his violin, follow the rat-gore and talk with the farmer all at the same time, came to a sudden stop. He turned towards the man, blinked at him for a moment, and then, with great control, said, "I guess I can see why you'd think that, but I'm not a ranger." "Yeah, I was starting to think that myself, with you not having a bow." Adian's frustration vanished for a moment, and he smirked as he held up the bow of his violin. "Well, technically I do have a—" The old farmer cut him off. "Besides, a ranger would have settled this in a flash. Well, ranger or not, you better kill those two or I'm going to take back my coin." Adian pretended to wipe his face as an excuse to rub his temples. "You keep mentioning pay. Are you mistaking me for someone who you actually hired for this job? Because the way I remember it is that your wife saw me in the village and she offered me some lunch to help her carry her purchases back here. Then, out of the kindness of my heart, I offered to look into the rat-gore problem when you brought it up. My intent is not only to kill the two that are bothering you, but to attempt to deal with the whole nest. That is why it's taking longer than you might have expected." Idian paused, but couldn't help continuing with, "But if you would like to pay me for my services, I definitely won't say no." "You're trying to rob us poor folk of our hard-earned coin," the old farmer shouted, a self-righteous look in his eyes. "I told Gladys you were trouble the moment I saw you, and I was right." Adian sighed again. It was moments like this when he regretted choosing his class and subsequently leaving his homeland and its privileges behind, but he forced himself to speak in an overly controlled tone of voice. "I remember because you said it to her right in front of me. But putting that aside, how are you interpreting me trying to help you as me trying to rob you?" "Well, you really aren't helping much, are you? You started trying to swindle me and let the Ratgors get away," the old man said, as he shook his head slowly back and forth. Adian stared at him, a look of disbelief etched onto his face. He looked up into the sky past the leafless branches, hoping for some sign from above that he didn't have to help these people, but no such sign came. So he gave a helpless little shrug and marched off in the direction that he had last seen the Ratgor in. He fumed as he tried to find clear tracks, which was proving to be quite difficult. Broken twigs and crushed plants, the signs he usually looked for, were kind of hard to spot when there wasn't any undergrowth. It was at times like these that he wished he had some of the skills of the ranger class, though he knew it to be a foolish wish. If one was going to be jealous about a class, then it had better be jealousy for the class as a whole. It was easy to pick and choose aspects of any class that were appealing. A warrior's strength, a mage's spell, or a chef's ability to cook were enviable. But a warrior's lack of magic, a mage's vulnerability, and a chef's lack of skills outside of the kitchen were also aspects of those classes. Even royal classes had their downsides, although few ever had the chance to realize it. Whenever Adian began to regret his choice or feel jealous, he made sure to think of the downsides instead of just the positives of other classes. In the end, he always came back to the same realization. He was glad that he didn't have those other classes. The field musician class simply fit him better than all the rest, which is why he had chosen it in the first place. He let out a low groan as his back began to ache from bending so close to the ground. His class was inconvenient at the moment, but it was far from his main frustration. He wasn't sure what frustrated him more, the farmer's inane babbling, or that the plan, one that he had been rather confident in, had been terrible. So terrible, in fact, that it had only worked when he had completely stopped doing it. Ratgor had low stamina. That is what he had been taught and had seen for himself in the past. With that in mind, he had chosen to speed himself up with his motivational march ability to match their speed. In theory, he should have been able to follow them until they started to grow tired, at which point they would lead him directly to their nest. What he hadn't anticipated was the increase in both their speed and endurance that appeared to have been brought on by whatever infection they had contracted. So, instead of them quickly tiring out, they had comfortably kept ahead of him for far longer than what Adian had anticipated, until, of course, Adian had stopped to talk with the farmer Tillman. Apparently, the moment he had become distracted, they attempted to lose him. This surprised Adian far more than their increased physical abilities. The one thing that everyone knew about Ratgor is that they were stupid, much more so than rats, their namesake, who could be quite cunning. These Ratgor weren't acting stupid, though. It was concerning, but Adian wasn't worried quite yet. He was under no delusions that he was some kind of Ratgor expert. He had only encountered the creatures a couple of times in the past, when routing nests with the Raven militia. Perhaps there was more to Ratgor than he had always believed. After enduring a bit more discomfort in his back, Adian found multiple signs of the Ratgors passing, all pointing in the same direction. It was comforting to know that they didn't appear smart enough to try and hide their tracks. With his direction decided, Adian turned to see both the farmer and his wife standing outside their little cottage, staring at him. He gave them a wave, and farm wife Gladys cheerfully waved back, while Farmer Tillman's frown deepened. Adian turned back, rolled his eyes, and brought his violin up to his shoulder. He played an upbeat but simple song as he started to walk in the direction of the Ratgor. After a few paces, he activated his skill, Motivational March, and smirked in appreciation as he felt his pace quicken, while his effort noticeably decreased. He kept up his fast pace of play, which he matched with his stride until he caught sight of the Ratgor pair between the tree trunks far ahead of him, at which point he stopped playing and consequently slowed down. The Ratgor seemed to have finally reached the limits of their stamina because their speed was slow enough for him to keep up with them with little effort. Even so, as he walked, he began to feel increasingly uneasy. He couldn't figure out why until, while listening intently for danger, he realized he heard nothing but the crunching of his feet on the previous year's dead leaves. There were no sounds of life, or even any of the other sounds one would expect in a forest. No chirping birds, no chattering squirrels. There weren't even any rustling leaves. It was unnatural, and noticing it did nothing to comfort Adian as he continued forward, twice as wary as before. It felt like forever, with eerie silence weighing on him, but eventually he caught sight of a hole in the side of a large hill. He crept up to a convenient vantage point on a slight rise behind a dead bush that had enough dead branches to provide limited cover. He crouched and peeked around it to observe what had to be the ratgor nest. At any one point in time, there were at least 20 ratgor scurrying in and out of the cave, over or around the hill. Adian wasn't sure if this was the standard activity, though. He suspected that his presence had raised their defenses. Undoubtedly, the two ratgor he had been following had heard his playing before he had caught up with them, and had put their nest on high alert. His musical class came with many advantages, but stealth was definitely not one of them. Since there were far too many of them for him to fight alone, he began to take mental notes. He would provide them to the local village leadership. As he was memorizing the layout of the nest and the surrounding area, he suddenly felt an intense unease, accompanied by a prickling feeling along the back of his neck. Adian responded immediately to the familiar sensation. He spun around and scanned the forest around him with a calm, focused gaze. He didn't notice anything out of place, but kept himself alert and ready for action. His sense danger ability had never failed him before, and he didn't expect it to start acting up now. He stayed poised like that for a few heartbeats, before it dawned on him that there was one direction that he had failed to check. His gaze shot upward just in time to see a large creature with glowing green eyes preparing itself to pounce. Adian reacted instantaneously, the training he had received since birth kicking in. He leapt to the side and swung his violin bow to intercept a swiping claw as the dark monster landed where he had just been standing. The bow deflected the paw, but the defensive move came at the price of Adian almost losing his grip on it. One of his most useful abilities, musician's weapons, greatly increased the offensive and defensive potential of all of his instruments. They were obviously still far from ideal in comparison to traditional weapons, but the time it took to drop an instrument and draw a sword was far longer than it took to lose one's life. Adian took a couple of steps back as the creature turned and hissed at him. He used the moment's respite to get a better look at his attacker. It was similar in form to a common house cat, but at a scale that Adian had only heard about in stories from far-off lands. Its lithe body was covered in sleek black fur. Green blotches, where its dark gray skin had broken, joined the glowing eyes as potential signs of disease. Unlike the ratgor, this creature was far from emaciated. If anything, whatever was corrupting it had increased its muscle mass. Adian's heart raced even faster, as the creature slowly prowled in a semicircle around him. It let out a low, rumbling noise that was half growl and half purr. Every fiber of his being told him to run, but his experience told him not to. Firstly, if he could take out this creature now, then it wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else in the future. Secondly, and more importantly, this monster was undoubtedly fast enough to catch up to him even if he did run. So Adian stood his ground and used a melodic battle cry to activate his skill, War Song. His heart still raced, but he could feel the skill focus his mind and strengthen his body. The corrupted cat responded with its own battle cry, in the form of a massive roar. Adian felt the sound hit him like a physical force, and pure terror tried to take control of his mind. While he was still fighting off the effects of the roar, the mighty creature leapt at him once again. He took the body of his violin and swung it backhand to slam into the cat's face. He immediately followed up with a forehand strike of the bow that took off half the cat's left ear as he sidestepped. The monster let out a strangled screech and immediately spun back towards Adian, close enough for him to smell rot on its hot breath. It raised itself on its hind legs and brought terrifying claws down with vicious speed. In the half-heartbeat, Adian had to think. He decided to finish the fight right here. He didn't try to sidestep or dodge. Instead, he moved towards the attacking creature, raised the body of his violin up to block the powerful claws, and stabbed up at the cat's throat with the razor tip of his violin's bow. The extended bow made contact first, and after only slight resistance, it slid deep into the center of the cat's throat. Unfortunately, a fatal blow doesn't always end the battle. The violin body blocked one of the paws, but the force was great enough to send it cracking back into Adian's own head. The other claw missed the violin completely, and instead dug into the meat of his shoulder. He didn't even have time to scream before the body of the monstrous cat bore him to the ground. Adian lay there, dazed. Something wet soaked into his clothes. The smell of copper and rot filled his nostrils. He knew that he should do something, but his mind was foggy, and he was glad for it. Clarity meant pain. He stayed like that, not daring to move until a familiar sound brought his heart to a stop. The multitude of undulating shrieks could only mean one thing. Adian shoved the creature's body off of him. His panic allowed him to push through the searing pain in his shoulder, pain that cleared the fog from his brain and snapped his thoughts into focus. He looked towards the ratgor nest, and his fears were confirmed. At least 100 glowing eyes were surging towards him, but he did have a few moments, at least. He took a small bottle filled with red liquid out of his belt pouch. He drank half of it and then poured the rest onto his injured shoulder. With clenched teeth, he endured the pain as the potion did its work. He glanced back towards the approaching ratgor, who had covered more than half the distance between them. He wasn't going to have time to let his wound heal completely, so he pushed through the agony and turned back to the dead monster. He spared half a moment to pity that he would need to leave the monster's body and forgo any bounty, but what good was bounty money to a dead man? He hurriedly pulled the violin bow out of its neck, and a green sludge spurted out rather than the expected red blood. He swallowed the bile that rose in his throat at the sight, grabbed the violin body from where he had dropped it, and ran. By the time the potion had healed his shoulders enough for him to raise his violin without screaming in agony, he could all but feel the ratgor's breath on his heels. He started to play and activated Motivational March once more. This time he chose a very different song. Instead of being bold, imposing, and authoritative, it was faster and borderline manic. This was not a song for marching into war, but a song for running from it. As the skill took hold, Adian felt his pace obviously quicken. It wasn't quite as effective as it should have been, an unfortunate side effect of the less than perfect play. A direct result of a panicked run through a forest with an injured shoulder and a violin that had just been used as a shield. It was enough, though, and after only a few moments, he pulled far enough away to no longer hear the ratgor's hissing breaths. The effects of his musician's weapon skill was the only reason that his violin could be played at all. If any other violin had been subjected to the beating that his had taken in the quick but ferocious fight, then it wouldn't be in one piece, let alone passably playable. As the potion continued to do its work and his mind continued to clear, he was left with more questions than answers. He wasn't sure how long his pack was going to follow him. He had honestly already expected them to stop, since he was already well away from their nest. With him still on his trail, though, he decided to change direction. The last thing he wanted to do was to lead them anywhere close to the old farmer and his wife. He kept playing and running, his lead slowly increasing, but the ratgor refused to stop chasing him. It was an odd behavior for them that Adian didn't understand, but he had no choice but to keep going, even as his legs burned and his breath came in pained gasps. After what felt like an eternity, he suddenly noticed that he could no longer hear any sounds of the ratgors chasing him. He looked back to see all the ratgor had turned, as if they were of one mind. Adian paused his playing as he watched them recede into the forest. Something was wrong. Perhaps many things were wrong. It was odd that they had given up so suddenly, but even more odd that they had been so organized in the first place. The chase had felt more like running from a contingent of soldiers than a pack of wild animals. As Adian tried to catch his breath, he consciously took in the world around him. He was surrounded by a luscious forest. Sunlight dappled the ground around him as it broke through the recently sprouted leaf barrier high. There was limited undergrowth containing what seemed to be an unprecedented number of wildflowers and edible plants. Small rustling noises and bird calls harmonized with the wind as it whistled through the trees, creating a natural song that contained a pure beauty of which he had yet to obtain in his own music. It was beautiful. Perfect. And that was the problem. He slowly retraced his steps. The anxiety rising in his stomach made him unable to enjoy the scene around him. It didn't take him long until he found the point where the ratgor must have turned back. There was a dividing line in the forest. The healthy, beautiful trees he had just been walking through turned abruptly into the sickly, still, and mostly dead plants that had surrounded the ratgor nest and the farmer's cottage. It was such a stark difference, he was amazed he hadn't noticed it the instant he had crossed it. However, if he was being honest with himself, he also could not pinpoint the time or place where the woods had turned from life to death when he had first entered this forest with farm wife Gladys. Adian smirked as he imagined his mother's voice saying, "I swear, Adian, when you get into your head, you couldn't find a tree in a forest." The smile died, though, as he stared at that stark line. It was replaced with a grimace and a quickly growing sense of unease. He needed to get back to that cottage.